I told my son I was losing my memory on a Thursday afternoon in October, sitting across from him at the kitchen table I had eaten at for 21 years, with my hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had gone cold because I had been rehearsing what I was going to say for long enough that I had forgotten to drink it. I told him the doctor had noticed some things. I told him it was early, and they were still running tests, but that something was there. I told him I wanted him to hear it from me before it went any further. He came around the table and put his arms around me the way a son does when he is genuinely frightened, the grip of a man who does not know what to do with his hands and holds on anyway. His name is Daniel. He is 44 years old, and he held on for a long time, and I felt the specific weight of someone who believes what you have just told them completely and has not yet begun to think past the believing. Then he pulled back and looked at me and said he needed to make a call. He stepped out onto the back porch. I stayed at the kitchen table, and I listened through the glass. I could not hear every word, but I heard enough. What I heard through that sliding glass door rewrote the last 2 years of my relationship with my son in about the time it takes to finish a cup of coffee that has already gone cold. My name is Harold Merritt. I'm 68 years old. I live in Asheville, North Carolina, in a house on Clover Ridge Lane that my wife Patricia and I bought in 2003, when Daniel was 21 and our daughter Rachel was 18. And the mountain view from the back porch was the reason we paid $12,000 more than we had intended to. Patricia said the $12,000 was not paying for a house, it was paying for a perspective, and she was the kind of woman who understood the difference between those two things and spent her life applying it to everything she touched, which is why the house looked the way it looked, and the marriage felt the way it felt, and why I have not been able to sit on that back porch for the 18 months since she died without thinking about what she said when we first stood there together and looked out at the ridgeline, and I asked her if it was worth it. She said, every single morning, it will be worth it. She was right. She almost always was. I want you to understand what that loss is before I tell you anything else about what happened in October, because the loss is the frame that holds every other part of this story in place. Patricia died in March of last year. It was a Wednesday. She had been managing a diagnosis for 14 months that we had managed together, which meant I drove her to appointments and sat in waiting rooms and learned the vocabulary of a disease I had not asked to learn, and she organized her medications in a weekly pill organizer she had labeled in her handwriting that I have not been able to throw away because it is still on the bathroom counter, and I am 68 years old, and some things you do not rush yourself on. She was 65. We had been married for 40 years. We had a list of places we wanted to go when I retired, the kind of list that lives on a notepad in a kitchen drawer and gets added to over the years without ceremony. Just the two of you eating dinner, and one of you saying, I read about this place, and the other one saying, write it down. The list had 17 entries. Kyoto was at the top, underlined, with a small star next to it that Patricia had drawn sometime in 2019 when she had spent an entire afternoon watching videos about temples and bamboo forests, and a particular kind of afternoon light she said she needed to see, before she decided whether photographs of it were honest or not. She did not get to find out. I retired from civil engineering in 2019, after 32 years with a firm that built bridges and water treatment facilities and the kind of infrastructure that people use every day without thinking about who designed it. The retirement was good. I had been careful with money the way men of my generation who grew up without it tend to be careful, which is thoroughly and without apology, and what Patricia and I had built over 4 decades was solid in every measurable way. After she died, I continued to be careful, partly from habit, and partly because being careful about the money was something I could do correctly in a season when almost everything else felt like something I was doing inadequately. Daniel lives in Charlotte, 2.5 hours east on I-40, which in good traffic is manageable and in bad traffic is a reminder that distances between people are not only geographic. He works in commercial real estate, is sharp and quick in the way of men who have made a career out of reading rooms and moving fast, and he calls reliably enough that I have no complaint about the frequency. What changed in the summer before that October Thursday was not the frequency, it was the content. In July, he mentioned twice that the Clover Ridge Lane neighborhood had been appreciating significantly and asked whether I had thought about what I wanted to do with the property long term. He said it conversationally, the way you mention something you happen to read, though he had never mentioned it before in 21 years of knowing I lived there. In August, he brought up a colleague of his who had recently helped an older client restructure assets ahead of an estate transition and said the colleague was excellent and had offered to take a look at my situation if I ever wanted a second opinion. In September, he asked how my financial advisor was handling my retirement accounts and whether I was satisfied with the returns, again for the first time in the history of us knowing each other. 3 separate conversations, 3 separate months, each one individually reasonable and collectively a pattern assembling itself the way patterns do. When you have spent a career reading structural load calculations and know that the stress does not announce itself before it arrives, it leaves indicators, and the indicators are there if you look. I looked. I did not say anything. I went to bed on the Sunday after the September phone call, and I lay in the half of the bed that was still mine by habit and stared at the ceiling in the dark, and I thought about Daniel, and I thought about what I was noticing, and I thought about whether I was a man who had lost his wife 14 months ago and was now reading suspicion into the ordinary concern of a son who was thinking about his father's future. I lay there for a long time with that possibility. I gave it the full weight it deserved. And when I was done, I knew what I knew, which was that the pattern was not concern. Concern asks how you are. What I was hearing was a survey being conducted one question at a time. I did not want to run a test. I want to say that plainly, the same way I would say it to Patricia if she were here, because she is the person I would have said it to first, and she is the person whose absence made the decision lonelier than it needed to be. What I wanted was a son who asked how I was sleeping. What I had was what I had, and before I did anything about it, I needed to know the full shape of it. I researched enough to be credible. A man of 68 who presents with occasional word-finding difficulty and reports that he has been repeating himself in conversation, noticed first by a neighbor, then by his own awareness of it, is a man whose doctor would order testing. Early-stage cognitive screening. Not a diagnosis, not a prognosis, just the beginning of a process that implies uncertainty and dependency, and the kind of future that prompts adult children to start thinking about timelines they were not previously thinking about. I called Daniel on a Wednesday and asked if he could come Thursday. I told him I needed to talk to him about something, and I said it with the weight of a man who has been carrying something and is ready to set it down. He arrived at noon. He looked good, the specific good of a man in his early 40s who takes care of himself and knows it. He came inside with the energy he always brought, direct and purposeful. The energy of someone who is ready to receive information and do something with it. We sat at the kitchen table. I told him what I had prepared to tell him. He came around the table and held on. Then he said he needed to make a call, and he stepped out onto the back porch and slid the door mostly shut. I sat at the kitchen table and I listened. His voice came through the glass low and fast. The voice of a man keeping his volume down and not quite managing to contain what he is actually communicating. I heard specific words because I was positioned to hear them, and because I had been listening for them since the summer. He said, "It's confirmed." Then a pause. Then, "Listen, call Marcus tonight. If this progresses the way these things usually do, we have a window before Rachel gets involved." She said, "Wait, and let him make his own decisions. She is not going to do that if she's managing things. We need to be the ones managing things." I sat at the kitchen table with my cold coffee, and I heard my son say, "The house alone is worth $450 easy in this market. If we can get him to agree to move somewhere more manageable before he gets worse, we control the asset timing. And if Marcus is in front of the accounts before she starts asking questions, we have the full picture before she does." He said she won't push back if it's already done. She never does. Then he said, "I have to go. I'll call you tonight." And I heard the back door slide open and I was at the kitchen table with my hands around my cold mug and my face arranged into the expression of a man who had not heard any of it. He came back in. He sat across from me and took my hands in his and said, "Dad, we are going to figure this out. I am going to make sure you have everything you need. I am not going to let you go through this alone." I looked at my son. I said, "I know, I meant none of it," which was a thing I had never done before at this kitchen table. Not in 21 years of meals and conversations and the ordinary transactions of a family, and doing it felt like something I was going to have to account for later, to myself, if not to anyone else. He stayed for 3 hours. He was warm and organized and mentioned twice that Marcus had excellent experience with this kind of transition and that it would be worth letting him take a look at the accounts sooner rather than later, before things got complicated. I said I would think about it. I walked him to his car. He hugged me again, the long hold of a man who is performing something and feeling something at the same time and cannot fully separate them, and he said, "Call me if anything changes." I stood on the front porch and I breathed the October air of an Asheville afternoon, The kind of cool that arrives in October here like it has been waiting just outside the county line and finally got permission to come in. And I thought about the man I had believed my son to be for 44 years. And I thought about the glass door and what had come through it. And I thought about Patricia on a Wednesday in March and what she would have said if I had called her from this porch and told her what I had just heard. Then I went inside and I called Rachel. Rachel is 41. She lives in Brevard, 40 minutes west. She teaches high school English, is the kind of woman who sends cards in the mail for no occasion, whose house always has something baking in it, who calls on Tuesdays not because she has a reason but because Tuesday is when she calls. Rachel and I have always had the ease of two people who have never needed a reason to be in the same room. Patricia used to say Rachel came out already knowing who she was, which is the rarest thing, and the gift of it was that she made everyone around her feel like they could know who they were too. She answered on the second ring. It was a Thursday evening, not her Tuesday call, and she heard the difference, the way people who pay attention hear the difference. She said, "Dad, what's wrong?" I told her everything. I told her about July and August and September. I told her about the test I had designed and the afternoon I had run it, and what had come through the glass door. I told her the specific words in the order they had arrived, because the order mattered as much as the words. Rachel was quiet through most of it, not the silence of shock, the silence of a woman absorbing something she had half known was coming and is now deciding what to do with the confirmation. When I finished, he said, before Rachel gets involved. Yes, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He's not wrong that I would want to wait and let you make your own decisions. He just has the wrong reason for why that's a problem for him." I sat in the living room in the chair I had moved to face the window after Patricia died, because the window looks toward the ridgeline, and some mornings the light does what Patricia said it would do every morning, which is justify everything you paid for it. I asked Rachel what she needed from me. She said, "I need you to call an attorney before Daniel calls Marcus. Whatever Marcus is, and I can find out what Marcus is. You need someone with your interest documented before anyone else has access to anything." She had the name of an estate attorney by the following morning. His name was Robert Cahill. He had an office downtown on Lexington Avenue, in a building I had walked past 100 times without registering it, which is the way most of the useful things in a life are situated until you need them. I called at 8:30. His assistant said he could see me Friday at 10. I was there at 9:40. Robert Cahill was 62. The kind of man who had built his practice on being underestimated in initial meetings and then being precise for the following 20 years until no one underestimated him anymore. He listened to me for 15 minutes without interrupting, which I took as competence. When I finished, he said, "Mr. Merritt, before we go any further, I need to ask you one question. What do you want the outcome to be? Not legally, but in your family." I had been sitting with that question since Thursday evening in the chair by the window. I will tell you what I had decided because the decision is the thing that everything else is built around, and it matters that you understand it before you hear what comes next. I did not want to punish Daniel. I am not being careful when I say that. I am being accurate. I had 68 years of knowing the difference, and the difference was not subtle. Punishment is about the feeling of the person delivering it. What I wanted was accuracy. I wanted the documents to reflect what was actually true about what I had, and who it belonged to, and what the terms were. I wanted the house on Clover Ridge Lane protected from a transaction designed to extract value from a man who was supposedly losing the ability to protect it himself, even though the man in question was losing nothing of the kind. I wanted Rachel to know that what I had was hers as much as her brother's, and I wanted Daniel, eventually, to sit in a room with me and his sister and the truth, without the performance. I told Robert these things. He wrote for a while and then he said, "I can give you all of that. What I want to do first is a full certified asset inventory, every account, every property, every investment, documented and filed so that the accurate picture of your estate exists on the record before anyone else has an opportunity to present a different picture. That takes approximately 3 weeks done properly. While that's underway, I want to look at the house specifically, because from what you've described, the house is where the immediate exposure is." He paused. He said, "You mentioned Marcus. Do you know anything about this person beyond the name?" "Daniel's colleague," I said. "Commercial real estate." "Daniel said he had helped an older client with an estate transition," Robert said. "That could mean a lot of things. What I want to know is whether anyone has presented you with anything to sign since July." I thought about it carefully. In September, At the end of the call where Daniel had asked about my financial advisor, he had mentioned that Marcus had a client newsletter that laid out estate planning options in plain language, and that he would mail it to me in case I found it useful. It had arrived the following week. I had set it on the counter in the kitchen and had not looked at it since, because I received more mail than I read and newsletters from people I did not know were at the bottom of the sequence. I told Robert this. He said, "Do you still have it?" I said I thought so. He said, "Please look when you get home and call me if you find it." I found it in the stack of mail on the kitchen counter, third from the bottom, behind a catalog I had not ordered, and a water bill I had already paid online. It was a single folded page on professional letterhead, tasteful and plain, with the name of a financial planning and asset management consultancy in Charlotte printed across the top. The front side was a newsletter, bullet points about estate planning, about the importance of early preparation, about the ways asset structures could be updated to reflect changing circumstances and family needs. The language was reasonable and the information was general, and nothing about it would have caught my attention if I had read it when it arrived. The backside was different. In the lower third of the page, below a section heading that read, "Client Authorization for Complimentary Portfolio Review," there was a paragraph of language, and below the paragraph there was a signature line. The language said that by signing, the undersigned authorized the consultancy to contact financial institutions directly to request account documentation for the purpose of providing an initial assessment. It said the authorization was limited to review and did not constitute a management agreement. It said the authorization could be revoked at any time in writing. What it did not say was that a financial institution, upon receiving a signed authorization from a client, he was under no legal obligation to notify that client of every subsequent inquiry made under that authorization during the review period. I called Robert from my kitchen. He said, "Do not sign it. Photograph both sides and send them to me tonight." He called me the next morning. He said, "Mr. Merritt, the authorization language on this document, if signed, would give this consultancy legal standing to request documentation of your investment and retirement accounts from the institutions holding them. It is not a power of attorney, but a signed authorization combined with a few well-timed follow-up requests to the right institutions could give someone a detailed picture of your full financial situation before you had any reason to know they had it." He paused. "This was sent to you as a newsletter at the suggestion of your son, following a conversation in which your son asked you about your financial advisor. I want you to think about the sequence." I thought about the sequence. The newsletter that was a newsletter on one side. The specific conversation in September that preceded it. The mention of Marcus in July and August. The slow positioning of a resource before the resource was needed. Daniel had not called me on a Thursday out of instinct. He had been preparing something since at least the summer, and the preparation had been patient and layered in the way that preparation is when the person doing it has thought about how to make each individual step look like something other than what it was. I thought about Patricia, who had been a high school librarian for 30 years and who had spent 3 decades teaching teenagers to read the structure of an argument and not just the surface of it. She had tried to teach me the same thing across 40 years of marriage with mixed results, though better results than she gave me credit for. She would have read this sequence in July. She would have said something in August. She would not have needed a Thursday in October with a sliding glass door. "Robert," I said, "how fast can we move?" The house went into a trust 17 days after my first meeting with Robert. Clover Ridge Lane transferred into a protective structure with Robert as independent trustee and Rachel as co-trustee, with terms that made what I had heard through the sliding door not merely wrong but legally impossible. No sale without independent appraisal and co-trustee approval. No family member as purchaser or purchaser's representative. No professional affiliated with any family member involved in any transaction without written co-trustee consent. The house was protected on a Wednesday. Daniel called Thursday to check in and ask how I was feeling. I said I was fine. I said the doctor had scheduled additional testing. I said I would know more in a few weeks. He said to keep him posted and to call if I needed anything, and I said thank you, and I meant it in the way you mean a courtesy when it is the only honest part of the exchange available. The asset inventory was complete in 25 days. Rachel drove over from Brevard the weekend it was finalized and sat at my kitchen table with the full documentation in front of her for the first time, and I watched her face as she saw the actual picture for the first time, the complete one, the one Daniel had been trying to get Marcus to see before she did. She sat with it for a while, then she said, "Dad, why didn't you call me in July?" "I thought it might resolve itself," I said. She looked at me. She said, It never resolves itself. I know, I said. We ate at the kitchen table. We talked about her students, and about a particular junior who had written something Rachel said was the best first draft she had read in 11 years of teaching, which was the kind of thing Rachel noticed and the kind of thing she said out loud because she believed the noticing was only useful if you said it. We talked about Kyoto, which I had not been able to talk about since Patricia died. I had not been able to open the notepad from the kitchen drawer where the list lived. Rachel knew about the list the way Rachel knew about most things in this house, because Patricia had told her and because she paid attention. She said, "Mom used to talk about Kyoto like it was already something that had happened to her, like she had already been there and just needed to get back." I sat at the round kitchen table and I thought about a woman who had spent an afternoon watching videos about afternoon light through bamboo and had drawn a small star next to the entry on a notepad and had not gotten there. "We should go," I said. Rachel looked at me across the table. She said, "I already have the list. Mom gave me a copy." I looked at my daughter. She said, "She made a copy in 2021. Said she wanted someone else to have it in case." "In case," I said. Rachel nodded. She reached into her bag and put a folded piece of paper on the kitchen table, and I could see before I unfolded it that it was Patricia's handwriting, dense and organized, the 17 entries with the notes she had added over the years. Kyoto underlined and starred at the top. I held it for a long time. The will revision was complete 3 weeks after the house transfer. Robert called on a Friday afternoon and said everything was filed and I was protected in every direction he had looked, and he had looked in all of them. I thanked him. I made dinner. I set the table for one the way I had been setting it for 18 months, not carelessly, because Patricia had said that a person who stops setting their own table has stopped expecting anything to arrive, and she did not want that for either of us, and I had taken the instructions seriously even after there was only one of us left to apply it to. Then I called Daniel and asked if he could come to dinner the following Sunday. I said Rachel would be there. He said, "Of course," and I heard the small recalibration in his voice. The social adjustment of a man who is deciding in real time what Sunday dinner with his father and his sister means, and whether it means what it usually means. Sunday in October in Asheville is the best version of October that October has available. The maples on Clover Ridge Lane were doing what they do in the second week of the month, which is turn a shade of orange that seems unreasonable until you have seen it enough years that you start to organize your calendar around it. Daniel arrived at 5. He looked the same, purposeful and well-managed, and he came in with the specific quality of a man who is performing ease and has been doing it long enough that the performance has become mostly genuine. Rachel was already there, in the kitchen finishing something she had brought from Brevard, because she did not arrive at a meal without contributing to it, and the exchange between the two of them when Daniel came in was the warm, slightly careful exchange of siblings who are on good terms on the surface and have not been in the same room with something true in a long time. We ate dinner. The conversation was careful in the way conversation is careful when people at a table have different amounts of information and everyone knows it, except the people who know the least. Daniel talked about a project in Charlotte. Rachel talked about her junior with the extraordinary first draft. I listened, and I watched, and I thought about structural load calculations, about the way a bridge distributes weight, about the way the stress moves through a system until it arrives somewhere. It can be named. After dinner, I said there was something I needed to tell them. I said, "In October, I told you I was having concerns about my memory. I need to tell you now that that was not true. I had a full evaluation in September, and there is nothing wrong with me. My memory is fine. My cognition is fine. There is nothing to manage." The table went quiet. Daniel looked at me. His face did several things in about 4 seconds, and the first one was not relief. The first one was the expression of a man who has been playing a game and has just been informed that the other player has seen the board differently than he believed. "You said the doctor noticed something," he said. I said I told you the doctor was running tests. That was true. The tests came back negative. What I did not tell you was why I asked you here in October before I had any results. He waited. I said, "Since July, Daniel, you have mentioned 3 times that this property has been appreciating. You have mentioned a colleague who specializes in elder estate transitions. You have positioned that colleague as a resource in every call since August. And 3 weeks after you mentioned he sent newsletters. One arrived in my mail with a client authorization on the back that, if I had signed it, would have given his consultancy legal access to request documentation from the financial institutions holding my retirement accounts." The table was very quiet. I said, "You stepped onto the back porch on Thursday afternoon and through the sliding glass door, I heard you tell someone to call Marcus before Rachel gets involved, that the house was worth $450 in this market, and that if you controlled the asset timing and Marcus had the full picture before Rachel started asking questions, it would be done before she had a chance to weigh in. Daniel said nothing. Rachel looked at her brother across the table. She said nothing, because I had asked her not to be present and let it go where it went. I said, "The house on Clover Ridge Lane is in a trust with Robert Cahill as independent trustee and your sister as co-trustee. It was filed 3 weeks ago. The terms make what you were planning not merely difficult but structurally impossible. The authorization document that arrived as a newsletter is documented in the estate file as context for the record, and every account, every investment, every asset has been inventoried and certified and filed, which means the accurate picture of this estate exists on the record in my attorney's office before Marcus, or anyone Marcus might have contacted, has had an opportunity to present a different picture." I paused. "Daniel," I said, "I am not asking you to explain what I heard on the porch. What I heard was specific enough that I do not need an explanation. What I am asking is whether you can tell me, without the Marcus structure and the newsletter and the positioning, what is actually going on." He was very still. He had his hands flat on the table, the way people put their hands flat when they need to feel something solid underneath them. Rachel looked at her water glass. I looked at my son. Finally, he said, "The Charlotte market is brutal right now." The table stayed quiet. He said, "I have 2 deals that were supposed to close in the spring that are still pending. I have a partner who is buying me out of a property I do not want to sell, on a timeline I did not choose. And I have a kid starting college in 2 years and another one 3 years behind her, and I did the math in July and the math was not good." He looked at the table. He said, "I told myself I was just thinking ahead, that I was just making sure I understood what the situation was before anything changed." "And Marcus," I said, "was a real resource," he said. "I did not invent him, but I pointed him at you instead of telling you what I just told you. Because telling you what I just told you means I have not figured my own life out, after 44 years of you figuring yours out, without asking anyone for help." He looked up. "And I know how that sounds," he said. "I know exactly how it sounds." Rachel made a small sound across the table, quiet and involuntary. I sat with what Daniel had said. Patricia had known something about this in Daniel. She had not said it exactly this way. She had said it about the way he managed everything. The speed, the self-sufficiency performed so consistently it had become a kind of rigidity, and that the rigidity was not strength. It was the thing you build when you believe showing need is the same as showing weakness. She had said it gently because she said things about her children gently when she did not want me to use them as verdicts. I had not used it as a verdict. I had not known what to do with it. I was working toward it still. "Daniel," I said, "you could have called me in July and said you were in a hard place and needed to talk. I would have listened." He looked at the table. "What you did instead," I said. "The newsletter, the asset survey, the window before Rachel gets involved. I cannot undo the feeling of hearing that, but I want to separate it from who you are. Who you are is not those things. Those things are what a person does when they are afraid to ask for what they need and have run out of time to keep waiting for the right moment." He looked up. His eyes were bright in the way that has nothing to do with tears and everything to do with something held carefully behind them. "I am afraid to ask for what I need," he said. "I know," I said. "You come by that honestly." Rachel made the sound again, slightly larger this time. She looked at her brother and something moved between them across the table. The particular thing that moves between siblings, when they are sitting with a truth that belongs to both of them, and they are deciding at the same time to stay in it. She said, "What does the gap actually look like? Tell me the number." He told her. She did not flinch. She picked up a pen from the counter behind her and wrote something on the edge of a napkin and pushed it across to me. She said, "That is documentable as a loan against his share of the estate. Robert can structure it so it is clean and on the record from the beginning. No gift, no ambiguity. Dad knows. I know. It comes off distribution. Clean." I looked at my daughter, who taught other people's children how to read what a thing was actually saying underneath what it appeared to be saying. "That is one option," I said. I looked at Daniel. He looked at Rachel. Then he looked at me. Then he pressed his hands flat against the table and breathed. "I should have just called you in July," he said. "Yes," I said. "You should have." "I'm sorry, Dad." I looked at my son. 44 years old with 2 kids and a deal pending and a fear he had been carrying long enough that he had built a structure around it instead of a conversation. The structure had been a bad one. The fear underneath it was one I recognized. "I know you are," I said. We stayed at the table until 8:30. Todd said very little after that, which was the right response to his situation, and which I respected him more for than I expected to. Daniel and Rachel talked about the finances the way they had not talked about anything in a long time, directly, in the specific register of people who have decided to stay in the same room with something true. I made tea at 9 because Patricia had always made tea at 9 and the habit was the house's as much as hers. I put 3 cups on the table. We drank tea and talked about less difficult things, and by the time Daniel left at 9:30, the room had lost most of the weight it had come in with. He hugged me at the door. I held on. I did not say it was all right because it was entirely all right, and he knew it and I knew it, and some things need to be said accurately even when you are standing in a doorway saying goodbye. What I said was, "Your mother would have had this conversation in July." He laughed the broken laugh of a man who is holding something back and cannot fully hold it, and he said, "I know. She used to say asking for help was just telling the truth about what you needed," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Remind me." I said, "Often." He left. I stood on the front porch until the October cold reminded me I was 68 and had forgotten my jacket again. I went inside. I watered the 2 plants Patricia had kept on the windowsill that I had managed to keep alive for 18 months, which she would have found funny given my historical relationship with houseplants. I sat in the chair by the window. Rachel came and sat across from me. She had her bag in her lap, and she reached in and put something on the table between us. It was the folded piece of paper with Patricia's handwriting. The list. 17 entries. Kyoto at the top, underlined, starred. "Dad," she said, "I want to go in the spring. You and me." I picked up the list. I looked at the star Patricia had drawn next to Kyoto. A small, careful star. The kind she drew when something mattered enough to mark. "Spring," I said. "I already looked at flights," she said. I sat in the chair by the window in Patricia's living room and I thought about a woman who had spent an October afternoon watching videos about afternoon light through bamboo and had drawn a star and had made a copy of the list and given it to her daughter and said in case, because she was the kind of woman who prepared for the things she hoped would not be necessary and made sure someone else had what they needed to carry it forward if they were. The house was protected, the record was honest, the documents were accurate. And somewhere in Rachel's bag was a list with a star at the top that Patricia had already made a copy of because she knew someone would need it after. We just had to go. If this story stayed with you, friends, leave a comment below and tell me which moment hit the hardest. And if you have been carrying something you have been too proud or too afraid to just ask for, let me leave you with what Patricia would have said, what she said to both of my children over the years when she saw them managing around something instead of through it. Asking for help is just telling the truth about what you need. That is the whole thing. That is all it ever was. Tell the truth. It is enough. Hit that like button, subscribe if you are not already here, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. New stories every week. I will see you in the next one.